Her name, Kwena Poko Mokotne, which in the language of the colonizers means chief eagle horse woman. Another identity, which of course is the published one, is Dr. Deborah Harry, a leader, a visionary, and activist from the Koi Kukaro Iwi of Pyramid Lake. She is a scholar and global leader in the movement to protect the rights of Indigenous people. All Indigenous people, our genetic resources, our Indigenous knowledge, our cultural and human rights and resources, our absolute possession, guardianship of taonga tukuiho, of biocolonialism. Her research has focused on the complex connections between biotechnology, prospecting, intellectual property, and globalization in relation to the rights of the Indigenous people. She advocates for these rights at some of the most terrifying, formidable, racist, and hegemonic world fora that currently plagues this planet and her resources. She has spoken and fought at the United Nations, in the World Intellectual Property Organization in Geneva, observing the Intergovernmental Committee on Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge, and Folklore. And she has also been a member and continues to sit on the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. She is also a filmmaker, and I think that the title of her film gives us some insight to her wry sense of humor. 2003 saw the production of The Leech and the Earthworm. Hoyanora. She is also the founder and executive director of the Indigenous Peoples Council on Biocolonialism. What becomes of our Manuka? What becomes of our Kawakawa? What becomes of those taonga tukuiho? These are the issues that Deborah and her work addresses. Nō reira, e te rangatira, nau mai, piki mai, haere mai, welcome to the extraordinary forum we have gathered here today, and welcome to the podium. E kui, karanga mai kui.
Thank you, Nahuya, for that really gracious introduction. It's so humbling. Doesn't sound like me. My name, Chief Eagle Horse Woman, is a spiritual name. That's who I really am. And the name comes from ceremony. It comes from the ancestors. That's how the ancestors view me. And what it reflects, really, I think, is my life journey and my path that has been determined for me. And certainly I couldn't have chosen to do the work I do. I couldn't even have imagined it. So I work with great faith in the Creator and in the guidance of the ancestors to do what needs to be done. Bija Tabino, Inamudui, Nu Deborah Harry Minania, Nu Quinat Bukut Mogotni, Nu Kuyui Dakara, Nu Kuyui Pa. Warm greetings, my relatives. My name is Deborah Harry. My name is also Chief Eagle Horse Woman. I'm from a place called Kuyui Dakara. Kuyui Pa. a high desert country in northwestern, what is now known as northwestern Nevada. Here's my river, some of our mauna, some of our mountains in the area. It's a beautiful landscape. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestors and the owners of this land that we were on. I would like to acknowledge distinguished elders, the spiritual leaders, our colleagues, friends, and whānau in the group here today. I'm honored also to share this time on the agenda with Moana Jackson, a man who I have greatly admired for many, many years. And I'll let you in on a little secret. I'm a little bit starstruck with him. So indeed, it is an honor to share some time on the agenda with Moana. This is a biocultural map of my nation. We call ourselves Numu. We're all known by our major food source, so that should be familiar to you all. We all like our kai. My people, oops. See if I can get this to work. Are from right there, Pyramid Lake, right in the central part of our territories, which stem really from the Columbia River in Washington and Oregon, all the way down through central and western Nevada, down into Death Valley, California. Our neighbors to the east are the Western Shoshone Nation, or we call them Numu. They're known as Numu. And our neighbors to the west would be many small indigenous nations throughout what is now known as the state of California. Most of you know me because of my work on biocolonialism, the work to prevent and protect indigenous peoples' genetic materials, traditional knowledge from misappropriation and misuse. In fact, that's the work that first brought me to Aotearoa back in 1995 at the invitation of Aroha Mead for a conference called Whose Genes Are They Anyway? And I was so amazed to find a sister here, a kindred spirit who was working on exactly the same issues that I was. Looking at these issues, these complex issues of science, biotechnology, issues around ownership, control, access, the imposition of intellectual property rights over all of these things that we consider sacred to us. And the debate has not gone away. It's become more and more entrenched, more and more complex. It's a global debate with many international rules, many international fora at play. Treaties are being made, have been made on these issues. Other treaties are being negotiated. And many times it's without our knowledge and most certainly without our consent. And so I've been busy keeping up with this work. Trying as best I can to do my eagle duty, which is to fly high and to see far, and to bring this information back to our peoples. And so you'll find my writings, you'll find primers and those kinds of things trying to make this information accessible to all of you. I would encourage you to look up the Griffith Law Review edition from 2010, I think it's December 2010. That's a publication of the proceedings from a conference held in Adelaide called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Where to From Here. And you'll find a number of articles, including my article in which I outline some of the more recent developments in this field, along with several other amazing contributions by writers such as Sharon Venn, a Cree attorney who's going to be joining us later today and will be here tomorrow, one of my own personal mentors and heroes who was at the United Nations before most of us were even thinking about it. So this is the work that brought me to the United Nations. I'm really quite a newbie because I didn't come to the United Nations until about 1994. About 1999. And at that point in time, we had already a number of pioneers who had been engaged in the drafting of the draft declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples. But it was my passion on these particular issues around biocolonialism that brought me to the United Nations. And I stayed with those issues. So I was not one of the drafters, but Moana certainly was. Sharon Venn was one of them. Glenn Morris, Professor Glenn Morris, the Shawnee attorney, was one of them. Aroha was there early in those early years, and I want to honor you and acknowledge you for all of the work that you did. And even before then, we had pioneers. And we have to remember that the work that we're doing is really off the back of our ancestors. As early as 1923, Diskahe, a Haudenosaunee leader, was in Geneva trying to get an audience at the League of Nations in Geneva. W.T. Ratana was also there in Geneva in 1925, working very hard to get an audience at the world's center of the world's leaders. In 1977, a delegation of Indigenous leaders from throughout Great Turtle Island and other places around the world went to Geneva and claimed space there, demanded that Indigenous peoples' rights and issues be heard in the international fora. And the reason they went there is because we know that we cannot get justice, we cannot get solutions at the domestic level. There is no possible way that a state-controlled court is going to rule against the state which it serves. And Indigenous peoples' rights are based on the rights of peoples and nations, their collective rights. We are peoples and nations. And if you look at these collective rights and how they are existing standards and law in international fora, then that's where we need to invest our time. If you believe in your self-determination and that right of self-determination and not a diminished right as the states would like to have us have, then we have to act as self-determining peoples and nations under the existing international law. I hope that you might get a chance to talk to people like Sharon Venn when she's here. She was at this meeting in 1977 when our leaders went to Geneva to do this work, and she talks about the discipline, the prayers, the ceremonies, the drum, and the care that was taken to advance the work of Indigenous peoples in such a careful way. And I think if you go to the United Nations today, you'll see that things have changed. Many meetings do not start with a prayer. Indigenous peoples had to fight to be able to offer prayer at the meetings in Geneva. They had to fight for that space, and they finally did. In fact, I think it was a Maori woman who did karakia in the General Assembly in Geneva when the chair was banging her gavel saying, no prayers here, Indigenous people. Well, she came in with karakia, and Indigenous people stood up and they did their prayer. So my understanding is that the chair gaveled, she says, okay then, we're going to close the meeting while the Indigenous peoples have have their prayer, and then she opened it again after prayer was given. You know, so it's demanding that kind of space. Today, I think it's very different. Today, I think what we have is a class of technicians, of Indigenous peoples who, because it's such an ongoing machine, Indigenous peoples have gained a certain level of expertise and comfort in working in the United Nations. And oftentimes, it's really hard to tell whose agenda is being advanced. I think it's very important to remember that these are state fora run by and for states. And Indigenous peoples are still trying very hard to find, to have a voice, particularly to have an equal voice, a voice that reflects our rights, our true rights as Indigenous peoples and self-determining peoples. This is where I met Nahuya in the halls of the World Intellectual Property Organization, where 3 treaties are being negotiated. Well, it might be 1 treaty, but it's likely to be 3 treaties. One addressing the so-called protection of Indigenous peoples' knowledge. And I say so-called protection because within intellectual property law, that's the framework for protection. There's no protection for our law, Indigenous peoples' law, and how we protect what is sacred to us. They want to use intellectual property law to protect Indigenous peoples' knowledge, basically making what's sacred to us market-ready, alienable, so that it can be bought and sold in a marketplace. The second treaty that they're negotiating is related to genetic resources. And then the third treaty or instrument that they're negotiating is related to traditional cultural expressions. So you can see that these are far-reaching subject matter that reach deep into the heart of Indigenous peoples' lands and territories. They're talking about access to and the commodification of, the misappropriation of, and the ownership by corporations of everything that's sacred to us, our designs, our songs, our expressions, possibly our medicines, that knowledge that we've had since the beginning of time. So these are the kinds of struggles that we have to pay attention to affect, if we can, and to protect Indigenous people's rights, if we can and where we can. You might recognize Aroha there, in the midst of very intense discussions related to a new treaty that's come out of the Convention on Biological Diversity called the Nagoya Protocol, which I consider a significant loss for Indigenous peoples, because in the Nagoya Protocol is completely subject to domestic interpretation. So access to genetic resources, issues related to benefit sharing from their commercial exploitation are all subject to state definition. And how they relate to Indigenous peoples is completely subject to state definition. So instead of setting an international standard, what we have are many standards as determined by states and how they want to relate to us. What I can say is that it's not fun work. I recall Linda's talk yesterday, and you talked about the need to, pay homage to our ancestors, but also remember why they were there. Why did we go into the international arena in the first place? It's not to do the state bidding. It's not to be their servants or to help them facilitate their agendas, but it was to stand strong to make sure that Indigenous peoples' rights are protected in an uncompromised manner. These are also fora where a lot of tactics take place. And the more you're around and watch them play out, the easier it gets to identify them. You can start to see the puppet strings. You can, you can start to see the tactics, and then you realize, oh yeah, I know that tactic. And so it's very important that we have to act on and stand on our right of self-determination, and it's an undiminished right. And I say that because there's current discussions taking place with regard to the high-level plenary meeting to be called a World Conference that's scheduled for next year in the General Assembly, where we're seeing the United States and other states suggest that there's a different kind of right of self-determination that's different than that which already exists in international law as it relates to Indigenous peoples. So of course that's a very dangerous concept. We also know that oftentimes Indigenous peoples who go in and take these strong stands and uncompromising stands have to take a risk, because many times they're standing against the tide, and they have to help and educate our brothers and sisters who are there to understand that, you know, there are state processes and state agendas being facilitated, and so that they're aware that these are happening. So they have to be very brave. Linda said, be aware of the polite conversations, particularly when there's only a few or one Indigenous person in the room. And this is definitely happening. Polite conversations, cloaked in the ambassador, you know, very ambassadorial discussions, but very frightening when you hear the tenor or the tone of the state's interventions that suggests perhaps, as I've heard New Zealand say, that Indigenous peoples do not have a right of free, prior, and informed consent. So this is the nature of the debates that take place. I've heard Canada suggest that they have to balance the interests of Indigenous peoples with that of non-Indigenous society. So, you know, these are the kinds of things that are suggested there. What I've heard that's most frightening in the World Intellectual Property Organization is states suggesting that they are themselves holders and owners of traditional knowledge. And can you imagine how dangerous it would be if a state assumed that it was the gatekeeper and holder and owner of your traditional knowledge? Ultimately, regardless of how difficult and challenging that work is, we're there to protect the future generations. It's not for us. We're not there for our own glory. In fact, I think it's probably aged us more than anything. You have to wear your protection, and you have to come out and cleanse yourself from these meetings because they're so fraught with pitfalls and with traps. And it's not an easy job to do. I'm at the point now where oftentimes WIPO events, they'll turn off my mic. I'll start to make an intervention and then they'll click, turn off my mic because, because they know I'm not going to support their agenda. They know that I'm there to help educate Indigenous peoples, and that happened just recently. That was quite telling. So as an aging activist, I think maybe this is a question that all of us ask ourselves. Who is going to carry on the work that we do? Who's training our young people to take these kinds of courageous stands that our ancestors have taken, these principled stands, these stands on their indigeneity, uncompromising? Who's training them? When I asked myself this question, I realized that nobody is. Nobody's working with my next generation of leadership who will be committed to perpetuating our people's rights, our people's lifeways, our people's culture, our people's knowledge into the future. In my area of the world, we do not have tribal colleges. We do not have Native American studies programs. We do not have indigenous studies programs in any of the institutions. It's very much a dry landscape like the desert we live in. And so what we've had to do is create what's going to work for us. And so I've devoted, I guess, the last 5 years of my, a good amount of my time and energy to this work of training the next generation of leaders who will carry on the work that needs to be done. It's called Pija Nadayadu Poinabi Marabwi, Making Good Strong Leaders, an emerging Indigenous Leaders Institute. It's intended to be a transformative, a leadership program for transformative action in Indigenous communities. When the word Poinabi is bolded because in our language, that's our word for leader. But our definition of a leader is one who speaks not only for the people, but for the land and for all living things. And it's very different than a Western concept of leadership, which is kind of a hierarchical kind of, person at the top. Instead, what it is someone who is actually on the bottom. They're in service to their community. People use the analogy that when you're an Indigenous leader, in this sense, your people step on your back because you're there to serve them. We've developed a pedagogical approach that is Numu-centric. It's based on Numu knowledge. Our students come into our program, they're young adults, ages 18 to 30, 40, somewhere in there. For many of them, this is the very first time they have been given the opportunity to be who they are, because this opportunity has not existed in the public schools that they have experienced through their educational lives. It fosters cultural vitality. For my students, I do not want them to say, oh, that person is more Indigenous than me. They sing their songs, they do their dances, they have the long hair and the braids. They're darker skinned or whatever, so that person's more Indigenous than me. No, I want my students to experience what it is to be who they are. And so we do our songs, we do our dances, we do our language, we play our games, we study the creation stories from our people, we study the writings of our elders, and that becomes the foundation from which we do our future work. The program fosters critical analysis. In other words, what we're fostering is a decolonization process. And then it serves as an exercise of self-determination. It is exercising self-determination. It is taking control over the education of our young people in a way that matters for us. This might look familiar to you. We know that colonization is external and internal. External, continuing legacy of the doctrine of discovery, the continuing onslaught over our resources, lands, territories, waters, genetics, knowledge, but also internal. And this is an analysis done by the students that looks at the internal impacts of colonization. Inner circle reflecting the impacts on the nation, the middle circle reflecting the impacts on the family, and the outer circle reflecting the impacts on the individual. And so you can see that the impacts are many. And what we do is we start from the assumption that no one has escaped the impacts of colonization. Not one person, not one generation. And for the students who sometimes think, oh, that happened a long time ago, when they came to this realization, they thought, wow, that's why things are the way they are. That's why what we see as dysfunction really has some deep roots. And so this really helps them to understand how things came to be in our world. And it's an essential part of their next step of the work, which is then to look at what does decolonization look like. Now that we know the impacts, what does decolonization look like? In terms of the curriculum, what we've developed are 6 sets: Indigenous nation building, Indigenous people's rights, international and domestic context, Indigenous wellness and healthy communities, Indigenous-centered education, sustainable Indigenous homes, families, and communities. And then the 6th one is nonprofits and alternative models for community development. And that's really to help them understand that you don't have to wait for somebody to come and fix our problems or implement solutions for us, that we can create our own vehicles for making change happen in our communities. But the way the program's designed really is a lot like your kite. It's really very much like a weaving, because what we have is every course is based on this formula. We start with our original ways of being and knowing. Then we look at the impact of colonization in our world. Then we look at strategies for decolonizing our world. And then finally, we look at what is our red road for the future. How do we implement the visions that we want to bring about? The cross-cutting themes in every course look at our own personal wellness, health, and well-being, be it medicine, be it nutrition, be it physical, be it spiritual, mental, and so on. We look at cultural and spiritual vitality. We look at our language revitalization and leadership skills and digital media. So all of those things are going on at the same time in each and every course. Building knowledge base, contemporary issues, inherent rights, nation building, international law, and many, many other subjects. Skill building, critical analysis, research, writing, public speaking, interviewing, teamwork, creative expression. The last piece of work that we did with our students was to take them as a delegation to the United Nations as a practicum. And we couldn't have been prouder of the work that these young people did. We were there to support them, and they self-organized. They worked incredibly long hours, and what they did was they worked primarily on the issue related to the discussion we had over lunch with regard to this high-level plenary meeting. And the students educated their peers. They were well prepared for the discussion and the work they had ahead of them, and took leadership positions in New York on this particular issue. When I think about the work we're doing, I like to think about the Turo Wampum, which was a treaty that the Haudenosaunee had in 1500s with the Dutch originally, and then subsequently with the English and the Americans. And as my Haudenosaunee friends have told me and explained things, explained the Turo Wampum to me, people such as Mike Myers and John Mohawk and other Haudenosaunee leaders, what they said is that the Turo Wampum reflects a parallel existence of indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples. And if you can imagine, it's these two peoples going down the river of life. The beads are two parallel beads on this wampum belt. Indigenous people stay in their canoe. The non-indigenous people stay in their ship. And the idea is that there will be peace and justice as long as we don't interfere with each other's vessels. And to me, then, you can't really stand on the tuwaka. You're going to be unstable. My program is about helping our young people stand firm in their waka, stand firm in their canoe. It's not about balancing two worlds. No, I want my young people to stand strong in who they are and then engage the world from that perspective. John Mohawk, a late Seneca scholar, wrote in one of his publications, he said, talking about us, he said, Indigenous peoples can become good subjects of the discourse, accepting the rules of law and morals without much question. We could be bad subjects, arguing that they have been subjected to alien rules, but always revolting within the precepts of those rules. Or we can be non-subjects, acting and thinking around discourses far removed from and unintelligible to the West. I'm encouraging my young people to be non-subjects, to stand firmly in our world, to stand firmly in our worldview. Our worldview is of no concern and no business to the West. It's our world. It's ours to protect now and into the future. Thank you.